Hey guys, welcome to the 11th episode of my poker vlog. As you've seen in most of my vlogs, I generally play pretty short sessions between work, raising a kid, and my wife being in the midst of school. It's hard to find time for more than a couple of hours of play when I can. However, this session is a really long one for me. It's about 7 hours in all, as my wife had some free time on this particular Saturday, and she was kind enough to let me go off and do my thing. So, unfortunately, my session starts out really rough. I'm card dead in the sense that I'm getting playable hands that are worthy of raising or calling raises in order to see a flop, but really nothing is connecting and my stacks just keep dwindling. There are a few big hands throughout this where I apply some pressure and, well, let's just take a look at a couple of those big ones. I start by buying in for $200, and by the time this hand starts, I'm sitting with $162 in front of me. I'm dealt 5-2 suited in spades, and I'm sitting in the small blind. There's 5 limpers, and I complete for $1 more. However, the big blind decides to raise to $12. Everyone ends up calling though, so I decide to join along since I'm getting such a good price. The flop comes 4-7-6 rainbow, so I flop an open-ended straight draw. I check, and the big blind continuation bets for $40. One other player calls, and I decide to call it here as well with my draw. The turn brings the king of spades. I end up picking up a flush draw to go with my straight draw. I don't really have enough to check raise here, and I don't want to check call. I decide to make a move for the pot, so I end up pushing all in for $110. My opponent ends up making the call. The river brings the 4 of hearts. I unfortunately miss everything, and I'm actually playing the board. My opponent shows pocket 7s for a flop set.
I had the straight and the flush draw. Missed them both. Go ahead.
At this point, I've lost my first $200 buy-in, and I've bought in for another $200. My stack has dwindled down with more of the same, where literally nothing's connecting, and I have to fold what are generally good starting hands on the flop or turn. By the time this next hand happens, I'm down to my last $61 from the second buy-in. I've got pocket 6s, and I'm sitting in the low jack. The middle position player raises to $12. I call, and the cutoff calls. So there's 3 players to the flop. The flop comes 4-10-3 rainbow. It's not the worst flop for my hand. I've got second pair, but if anybody hits the 10, I'm behind here. The middle position player ends up continuation betting for $30. I shove for $99 total, and the better ends up calling for $69 more. The turn and river bring the 9 of hearts and the 5 of spades. My opponent ends up showing that he has 10-8 suited in clubs for a flop top pair. I should have either shoved pre-flop or folded, and I generally was not playing at my best at this point. Admittedly, I had a pretty bad headache at the table for most of my session at this point, and I feel like it's definitely been affecting my play. Interestingly, I think I may be susceptible to compression headaches as I removed my hat shortly after this hand and found my headache start to go away, thankfully. It's not the first time I've noticed this, but it is the first time I started to put 2 and 2 together. In this next hand, I've got ace-10 suited in hearts. I won't go into the details of this hand, but it's just another one of those hands where I've been raising pre-flop and continuation betting on the flop, only to get re-raised by someone who hit the board hard while I completely missed. You can hear exactly how frustrated I am when my opponent raises here.
130.
Fucking knew it. Every fucking hand, man. You're good.
Despite all this, ever since I removed my hat and my headache started to go away, I've noticed that I've become able to focus a bit more on the game. On that note, here's a couple of interesting hands where I had the right insight into what was going on with my opponent's hands, even if I lost the hand. In this first one, I've got ace-5 suited in spades, and I'm sitting in the small blind. The button open limps after everyone else folds, and I decide to raise to $16. The big blind and the button both call. The flop comes 2 ace-8 rainbow, so I flop top pair and a not-so-great kicker. A continuation bet for $21. The big blind folds, and the button pushes all in for $101. This opponent's been pretty tight, so I end up folding here with top pair. I suspect he either limped a pair of deuces or pocket 8s and flopped a set, or maybe has a hand like ace-king.
I feel like you flopped a set of deuces there or something.
Oh my god.
And a few hands later, I've got queen-jack offsuit. I failed to capture the board here, but I essentially flopped top pair, and my opponent called down and made a play here on the river that led me to believe he had a specific card in his hand.
You got the ace of hearts, don't you?
How did you know? How did you know?
At this point, I've bought in twice for $200 and once more for $300. I've lost $580, and I'm down to my last $120. That's when I look down and see pocket aces. Not counting bomb pot PLO hands, this is the first time I've seen aces since I started playing poker again 3 months ago. I'm really hopeful that my hand will hold given how bad my day's been going so far. We see one limper into the pot, and I raise to $10 in the cutoff. 3 players call, and I have position going to the flop. The flop comes 3 king 9 rainbow. The small blind leads into me for $25. It folds to me, and I call with the intention of letting my opponent continue the aggression on the following street. The turn brings the 4 of spades. He bets enough to put me all in, and I call for $85 behind. On the river, we see the 6 of diamonds. I show my pocket aces, and my opponent shows the king of hearts and mucks his hand. I finally scoop a pot.
I got scared. I was like, no fucking way, dude.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
About 20 minutes later, I find myself with pocket queens sitting in middle position. It folds to me, and I raise to $10. The button calls and both blinds call, and we see 4 players to the flop. The flop comes 4-9 ace rainbow. I hate this flop, but I want to find out where I stand. When it checks to me, I continuation bet for $15. The button and the small blind both call. The turn brings the 8 of spades. It checks to the button, who bets $45. I haven't seen this player bet without a made hand at this point, and there's no reason to suspect he's bluffing for any reason. It folds back to me, and I fold and show. My opponent gracefully shows that he did, in fact, pair the ace on the board, and my fold was good.
Always an ace on the flop. That's him. Yeah.
A short while later, I'm dealt queen 10 suited in spades, and I'm sitting in the hijack. There's 2 limpers, and I raise to $12. Only the limpers call, and we've got 3 players to the flop. The flop comes 6 ace king with 2 hearts. It checks to me, and I continuation bet for $15. The first player calls, and the second player folds. The turn brings the 3 of spades. It checks to me, and I bet again for $25. My opponent says he needs help and makes the call. The river comes the 2 of clubs. My opponent checks to me, and I decide to fire a third bullet here. I make it $45. My opponent shows that he has an ace and is trying to gauge my reaction. I need a fold here, or I'm pretty much done with a big loss for the day. After almost 2 full minutes, he finally tosses his cards into the muck. I show the bluff and scoop the pot.
Thank you.
The very next hand, I'm dealt pocket jacks, and I'm second to act. The under the gun player limps, and I raise to $10. The hijack calls, the cutoff calls, the big blind calls, and the under the gun player calls as well, and we've got 5 players to the flop. The flop comes 2 jack 4 with 2 spades, so we flop top set. I've missed so many sets today while the player on my left hit set after quads, and it's been quite frustrating. It's really relieving to finally hit something. It checks to me, and I lead for $25. Only the cutoff calls, so we're heads up to the turn. The turn brings the 9 of hearts. I checked my opponent with the intention of check raising, as he seems interested in the pot, and I believe he's got a hand. He bets $65, and given the draws, I don't want to wait any longer to put my money in. I push all in for $160 total. My opponent pretty quickly makes the call. The river brings the 3 of clubs. I show my hand, and my opponent mucks. We scoop a huge pot. The gentleman later told me that he only called me there because I showed my bluff with queen 10 in the previous hand, so it turns out that showing my bluff was beneficial.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
In this next hand, I've got 4-3 suited in clubs, and I'm sitting on the button. The hijack raises to $15, and the cutoff calls. I decide to call here since I'm a bit deep now, and I'll have position on the hand. The big blind calls as well, and we've got 4 players to the flop. The flop comes 2 queen jack with 2 clubs, so I flop a flush draw and not much else. It checks to the pre-flop raiser, who leads for $25. The cutoff calls, leaving himself $4 behind in his stack. I call here since I'm getting a good price on my draw, and the big blind calls as well. The turn brings the 8 of diamonds. It checks to me, and I check behind, wanting to see a free river. The river comes the 10 of hearts. I miss my draw, and when it checks to me again, I think about whether it's worth bluffing at the pot here. Normally, this feels like a great spot to bluff, given the scary board and the fact that we've had 2 streets where it checked around. I imagine anyone holding a 9 for the straight would have led out in the river. Since that didn't happen, I could steal here. However, I mentioned that the player on my right has $4 behind. He could call with just about anything and I'd lose. In the end, though, it feels like a great opportunity. Even if he does call, I'm effectively only risking $4 to win $163. With that in mind, I bet out here for $100. As expected, it folds around to the player on my right, who calls me with his last $4, who reveals that he has a 2 for bottom pair and scoops the pot. The pre-flop raiser is clearly heated about my play here, telling me how bad my bet was. My takeaway from what he had to say is that he's mad because he didn't get a free showdown and clearly had a better hand than bottom pair. However, I don't think my bet here was bad, given that I expected it to be a very small risk, $4, for quite a big reward, $163. Let me know in the comments what you think about my bet here. In this next hand, I've got queen jack offsuit, and I'm sitting in the low jack. There are several limpers into the pot, and I raise to $12. 5 players end up making the call, so we've got 6 players to the flop. The flop comes 10 jack 7 rainbow, so I've got top pair second kicker. It checks to me, and I lead for about half pot, $35. The button calls, the small blind calls, and the player to my right goes all in for 160. Given how this player's played in previous pots, I can't see him doing this without a made hand. I fold, and after everyone else folds behind, he shows me that he had 9-8 suited for the flop straight.
8-9? Ah, yeah it is. Thank you for showing that. That's,
I just showed you for a heads up, but we had other people in there.
A half hour later, I pick up pocket queen sitting in the cutoff. An early position player raises to $6, and another player calls. I raise to $25, the button cold calls, and the early position player calls. So we've got 3 players to the flop. The flop comes Jack 8 ace with 2 spades. Not happy about the ace, but when it checks to me, I still bet and I make it $20. The button calls and the early position player folds, so we're heads up to the turn. The turn comes the 3 of clubs. It checks around, so I don't think my opponent has an ace at this point. The river brings the 10 of spades. I check again, and my opponent bets $40 here. I don't think my opponent has an ace, but the river is a pretty ugly one that could have helped him if he had a straight or flush draw. I'm trying to think through what he might have here, and I think there are enough missed straight draws with hands like 10-9 or King 10, Queen 10 that could be making a play for the pot since I've played my hand a bit transparently, and I eventually make the call. Unfortunately, my opponent shows Jack 10 suited for a river 2 pair, and we lose another one.
Nice hand.
In this next hand, I've got ace 2 suited in diamonds, and I'm sitting under the gun. I limp in, the player behind me limps in, and a middle position player who's a young kid who bought in short and seems like he hasn't played much poker before raises to $10. There's 3 callers, so I call and the limper behind me calls as well, and we've got 6 players to the flop. The flop comes 7 Jack King with 2 diamonds. It checks to the pre-flop raiser who leads for $10 again. The player behind him, who's been very aggressive with miscellaneous rag hands, raises to $30. It folds back to me, and I make an aggressive shove here with my flush draw for $90 effective. The young kid folds, and the aggressive guy calls all in for his last 90. My hand doesn't improve when the turn comes the 4 of hearts, and the river comes the 10 of spades. My opponent unfortunately shows King 3 suited in diamonds. He flopped a worse flush draw, but he paired his king on the flop, so we lose this one. I'm down to my last $87 here after that last hand, and I pick up Queen Jack suited in spades. I'm sitting in the big blind. The first player limps into the pot. The young kid that I mentioned earlier raises to $15 in middle position. 2 players behind him call, the small blind calls, I call, and the under the gun limper calls as well, so we've got 6 players to the flop again. The flop comes Jack 3 King Rainbow, so I flop second pair with a backdoor flush draw. It checks to the under the gun player who opens for $13. The pre-flop raiser and 1 player behind him both call. 2 players fold, and I call as well, so we've got 4 players to the turn now. The turn brings the 2 of spades. I pick up a flush draw to go with my second pair. Given how weak the flop bet was and the fact that no one showed interest with a raise, this feels like a good spot to apply some pressure. I push all in here for $59. It folds to the young kid who ends up making the call. The river brings the jack of clubs. I don't hit the flush, but I end up picking up 2 pair. My opponent shows ace king for top pair, and my hand is good. 30 minutes later, I'm looking at pocket king sitting in middle position. The first player to act raises to $10, and the player on my right calls. I re-raise to $40, and it folds to the loose aggressive player in the big blind who cold calls. Everyone else folds, so we're heads up to the flop. The flop comes 2 Queen 8 with 2 spades. My opponent checks to me, and I continuation bet for $35. He immediately pushes all in over the top with his last 67, and I insta-call. My opponent shows Queen 10 offsuit for a flop top pair. The turn brings the 8 of diamonds and the river the 4 of spades. His pair doesn't improve, and we scoop a much-needed pot.
No flush, no flush. Yeah, I got him covered, yeah. Thank you.
A little bit later, I pick up pocket 8s sitting on the button. The second player to act limps in. The middle position player raises to 15. It folds to me, and I decide to be aggressive here with my position and the few number of players in the pot. I re-raise to 50. The player on my left, who's sitting in the small blind, and has been an absolute calling station that's been miraculously hitting everything since he sat down, cold calls my 3-bet. The limper now shoves all in for $63. It's not big enough to reopen the raising, unfortunately, meaning I can't protect my hand from anyone else here. The original raiser calls, I call, and the small blind calls. The pot's over $250 before we've even seen a flop. The flop comes Queen King 5 with 2 spades. We see 2 big overcards to our pocket pair, and the calling station small blind immediately leads for $50. Given his typically passive play, I know I'm behind here, and when it folds to me, I fold as well. He flips over King 3 offsuit for top pair, which was clearly good enough to call a 3-bet out of position in the small blind with pre-flop. That's Texas poker for you. The very next hand I've got 6-5 offsuit sitting in the cutoff. 4 players limp in, so I decide to limp in the cutoff as well since I've got good position. The button ends up raising to $12 though. 3 players make the call, and I decide to call as well since I imagine I could get paid off if I hit something big against the calling station who's suddenly betting out. The flop comes 2-10-3 with 2 spades. I flop a gut shot and it checks around. The turn brings a miracle 4 of diamonds and I've got the nuts now. The first player to act leads for $27. This is the same guy I bluffed in the Queen 10 hand much earlier, and I feel like he's been looking for a spot to get me back. I decide to call despite the flush draws in hopes of getting another bet out of him on the river. The pre-flop raiser folds and we're heads up to the river now. The river brings the Queen of diamonds. The backdoor flush hits, but when my opponent checks to me, I'm pretty confident that I've got the best hand here. I want to make a bet that will get called, and I end up making it $50 straight. After about 30 seconds of thinking, my opponent makes the call and I show my hand. My opponent mucks and we scoop the pot.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.
2 hands later, I'm dealt King Queen suited in spades, and I'm sitting in the low jack. 1 player limps in, and I raise to $12. The calling station to my left calls in the hijack, the cutoff calls, and a limper calls as well, so we've got 4 players to the flop. The flop comes King 6-5 with 2 clubs, so I've got top pair, second kicker. It checks to me, and I open for 30. The calling station calls, the cutoff folds, and the limper folds. The turn brings the 8 of diamonds. The calling station is probably on a draw, as he's often been, and he's been calling down for just about any price. I want to charge him big to hit whatever draw he might be on, so I bet big here. I make it $100 even. He thinks for 20 seconds and ends up making the call. The river brings the ace of spades. This is not the river I wanted to see. If my opponent was on a flush draw, it's possible he was on the ace-high flush draw. However, we've clearly seen him play rags regardless of the price, so I don't think we can just assume that he's got an ace here. All that considered, I opt to make a blocking bet of $50. Another 20 seconds pass and my opponent throws his cards into the muck. It seems like our read about him being on a draw was correct. We maximized our value and scoop a massive pot.
You used to be people mark time.
The very next hand, I'm dealt pocket jacks. I'm still stacking chips from the last hand, and I couldn't even get the camera started in time for this hand. I'm third to act. After the first 2 players fold, I raise to $10. The calling station calls, the next player re-raises to 30. It folds back to me, and I decide to push all in to get the calling station out and get heads up against the 3-better at worst. The 3-better was short stacked at this point, so I wasn't really risking too much in all. The calling station folds, and the other player calls all in for 72 total. My opponent shows 2 red kings, unfortunately. The board runs out 3-2-5, 8-8. We don't improve, but it wasn't too big of a hit, thankfully. Just a few hands later, I pick up pocket king sitting in the small blind. We see 4 players limp, and I raise big since I'm going to be out of position. I make it $21. The big blind calls, the under the gun player calls, the middle position player calls, the low jack calls, and the button calls as well. So we've got 6 players to the flop. The flop comes 10-3-8 rainbow. Thankfully, there's not an ace on this board. I'm the first to act and continuation bet for $75. Surprisingly, everyone ends up folding, and I pick up a nice pot with no resistance.
Thank you.
I'm still down on the day, but I'm getting close to being even again. About 10 minutes later, I pick up 9-8 suited in clubs, and I'm sitting in the hijack. The first player to act straddles for $5. The player to my right raises to 15, and I call with this nice suited connector hand. The straddler calls as well, and we've got 3 players to the flop. The flop comes 3-10 queen with 2 clubs. I flop a gut shot straight flush draw. It checks to me, and I open for 25. Both my opponents make the call, so we're all headed to the turn. We see the 5 of hearts come out on the turn, and unfortunately our hand doesn't improve. Given the resistance, I opt to check behind after both players check to me again. The river brings the 3 of clubs. We hit the flush. The board pairs though, so we're losing to a boat. Given the action, I don't feel too concerned about that being a possible holding for any player though. The straddler leads for $105. He's been playing pretty aggressively, raising a lot lately after losing a big chunk of his stack. I feel like I'm probably ahead of his range, even though the size of his bet is pretty scary. However, the player to my right makes the call, and now I'm wondering if my hand is any good. After a bit of thinking, I legitimately think that I might have the best hand, and I end up overcalling as well. The player who bet out shows that he hit trips on the river. I show my flush, and the player to my right mucks, saying that we both have him beat. We somehow have the best hand and scoop an almost $450 pot.
Thank you.
I finally recuperated my loss, and I'm back to even for the day. In fact, I'm a little bit above even now. I'm relatively card dead for the next hour and a half until I finally pick up Ace-King offsuit. I'm sitting in the small blind. The second player to act limps in, the middle position player limps in, the button limps in, and I raise to $20 from the small blind out of position. Only the calling station calls from the big blind, and we're heads up to the flop. The flop comes King 8 Ace Rainbow, so I flop top 2 pair. There aren't too many draws other than Broadway, so I imagine I'm probably way ahead here. Still, I don't want to give away any free cards, so I lead for $20. My opponent pretty quickly makes the call. The turn brings the King of Hearts. We turn a boat. I doubt my opponent has pocket aces here, so I've essentially got the nuts. Both our stacks are very deep at this point, and I want to maximize value to get as many of those chips as I can. Even though the player to my left has been a calling station when he's been on a lot of draws, I have seen him bet on occasion when checked too. I don't want to scare him off with the board paired, so I opt to check here to let him take control. He ends up taking the bait and betting out for 30. I don't want to scare him off, so I just call for now. The river brings the 6 of hearts, which brings in the backdoor flush draw. I check once more to give my opponent a chance to bluff again. He bets as I hoped, making it $40, and now I want to see how big I can raise and still get a call. After some thinking, I decide that given he's bet on multiple streets, there's a chance he's got something that's worth calling with. I make a big raise to $165, so $125 more for my opponent to call. Unfortunately, it looks like I either raised too much or my opponent was on a total bluff, as he ends up throwing his cards into the muck. Either way, I scoop another nice pot.
Thank you.
The last interesting hand of the night comes just a few hands later when I'm dealt 7-6 suited in clubs. I'm sitting in the hijack. Several players limp in, I limp behind, the cutoff limps, and we've got 6 players to the flop. The flop comes 2 Queen 9 with 2 clubs. I flop a flush draw in a small pot, but not much else. The middle position player leads for $15. It's bigger than the pot, but I feel like my implied odds are good against him, so I make the call and the small blind calls as well. We've got 3 players to the turn. The turn brings the 8 of spades. I don't hit my flush, but I've now got a straight draw to go with my flush draw. It's possible that a 10 is not a legitimate out though, as any jack would make a higher straight. The middle position player leads for $35. This is the same player as earlier who made the large river bet with trips into my flush. He's been sacking off and has a small stack at this point, and even though I'm not getting the direct odds to call here, I decide to call with the idea that my implied odds make this call okay. As soon as I call, the small blind player goes all in for $79 total. The middle position player calls, and even though I've gotten myself into a bit of a pickle now, I'm priced in to call the shove, as it's only costing me $44 more to win $250 total. My pot odds are about 5-1, with my chances of hitting the river being about 3-1, so with that I make the call. The river brings the 5 of clubs. We hit the flush. My opponent pushes all in for his last $17, I make the call, and both players muck. I scoop another large pot.
Thank you.
This session was exhausting. I haven't played poker for so many hours in a very long time. I feel fortunate to have been able to recover from such a big downswing at the beginning, which I attribute to both having a bit of bad luck and variance, as well as definitely making some bad plays. In all, I bought in for $700 total, and at my lowest point, I had about $87 in front of me. I managed to work that up to $1,089 for a win of $389 total. And after taking into account the $10 hourly fee and the cashier tip, I ended up with a profit of $315 for the session. So I'm happy to take that, given how far down I was. But hopefully we'll keep you continue to trend in that direction. I've still got a long way to go before I hit my 10K bankroll goal, though. I'll include a bigger update in a future vlog as I get close to reaching that. Until next time, though, thanks for watching. Please hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed the video. But thank you either way, and take care. So long.